Hey everyone, welcome to our last video on the patterns of population change. In this section, we're going to talk about when populations change so much that they actually become a whole new species. So we're going to talk about speciation that can happen in an allopatric pattern, in a sympatric pattern, and then we're going to talk about some other patterns of evolution like adaptive radiation, coevolution, convergent evolution, and rate of speciation. Rate of speciation is going to be a review from a couple of videos ago. Speciation basically occurs when two populations become so different from each other, they diverge so much that they can no longer even reproduce together. Um, Darwin thought he saw this with the finches on the Galapagos Islands. He thought that over time, natural selection had led from one original ancestral finch to many different types of finches on the different islands, some being insect eating, some being woodpeckers, and some being seed eating, and their beak shape changed. And now no longer can the seed eating finches actually mate and reproduce successfully with the insect eating finches. So they've become so different from their original finch that they can no longer breed together. The first type of speciation I want to talk about is allopatric speciation, and this occurs when there's an actual physical barrier that separates two populations, and so now those two populations end up becoming two separate species. Those physical barriers could be things like mountain ranges or like rivers or channels between islands or lava flows. And what happened here with these squirrel populations is that originally the Grand Canyon did not exist. It was just a big space of land. But then the canyon formed with the river coming through, and there were squirrel population. There was one big squirrel population that existed all over, but they got separated by the canyon. And now on one side of the canyon is the kaibab squirrels, and the others have the Albert squirrels. And so those two species have actually evolved to be two separate species, even though originally they were from the same population, but there was the physical barrier of the Grand Canyon that was formed and came between them. And now they're two separate species who are not able to mate together to produce fertile offspring. When it's a physical barrier, it's called allopatric speciation. When it's not a physical barrier, it's called sympatric speciation. This is actually going to happen when the ancestor species and the new species live side by side when they split and become two species. So, for example, you can see down here with hawthorn flies and apple maggot flies. They actually live in the exact same area, but they have become two different species based on the food that they eat. The apple maggot fly prefers to eat apples, and the hawthorn fly prefers to eat tomatoes. And their bodies have become specially adapted for them to eat those different foods. The apple maggot fly's body has become adapted to eat apples, and the hawthorn fly's body has become adapted to eat tomatoes. So even though they live in the same general area, now only the apple maggot flies whose bodies are adapted to eat apples are going to mate, and the hawthorn flies are only going to mate with other hawthorn flies who are going to eat tomatoes. So they still live in the same area, but because of their behavioral differences and their difference in food source, they actually have evolved into two separate species without a physical barrier. That's sympatric speciation. Let's go on to talk about some patterns in evolution. Let's talk about adaptive radiation. This is also known as divergent evolution, and it happens in a relatively short period of time when one original species, like the finch on Darwin's Island, gives rise to many different species in that certain area based on new habitat or new opportunities. So, in the event of Darwin's finches, that original finch was there, but then came those different islands, and the different finches on each island adapted to have different beaks to eat the food that was available on each island. And so they became different species from that one original species. One example of this happening occurred in Africa at Lake Victoria. There are actually now more than 3,000 different cichlid fish species in Lake Victoria, and we believe that they came from one common ancestor that lived about 14,000 years ago. So that there was just one species of cichlid fish that lived 14,000 years ago. But because Lake Victoria offered a lot of different opportunities with food, certain ones of those fish populations specialized based on what it ate, which is ecological opportunity. The fish eating cichlids started to look a certain way. The zooplankton eaters tended to look a different way. The leaf eaters looked a different way. The insect eaters did, algae scrapers, and snail eaters all ended up looking different. Even though they lived in that one area of Lake Victoria, there were different food opportunities. And so from one common ancestor came many different species, actually 3,000 different species, and they all have different things that they do, different things that they eat, and they can no longer interbreed. The fish eaters no longer breed with the plankton eaters. The snail eaters no longer breed with the fish eaters. And so that's actually an example of sympatric speciation, but because it happened in a short period of time, a short burst of 14,000 years, which doesn't sound that short, but compared to the whole, scale of all time, that's a pretty short period. That's considered adaptive radiation. It also occurred when the dinosaurs went extinct because when they went extinct, the Cenozoic era began and mammals were actually able to emerge. And there went from being just very few mammal species because the dinosaurs had kind of kept them in check to being very many different mammal species across Earth. That's adaptive radiation if it happens in a short period of time. Next up, we've got coevolution. This is when two species form a close relationship with each other. One example is mutualism. And in the word mutualism, both organisms are benefiting from each other. So the comet orchid plant benefits from certain moths pollinating them. And the orchid has become a certain shape so that only that certain species of moth can pollinate it. That's beneficial for the moth because it doesn't have to compete with other moth species. And it's beneficial for the flower because it gets the best pollination from that one species of moth who's specialized to actually pollinate it. So over time, that moth species has changed the shape of its beak to be able to eat from certain flowers, and the flowers have changed their shape to be able to match that moth so that there's a relationship between the moth and the flower. That's coevolution. It can also happen with parasites. And one example of that would be if a plant has a certain chemical to deter predators, predators will develop a tolerance to the chemical, and then the plant has to make a harsher chemical, and then predators get a more tolerance to the chemical, and then it goes back and forth like that. That's how you can end up with things like peppers that are very, very, very spicy because there's some organism they're interacting with where that spicy chemical has evolved to basically match whatever is going on with that predator trying to eat it. That's coevolution when two species evolve in a close relationship with each other. Convergent evolution is when completely unrelated species evolves to have similar traits, even though they live in completely different parts of the world. But those different parts of the world, even though they're geographically far apart, have similar ecology and climate. So, Australia is a big example of this. In Australia, there are a lot of really unique species because Australia is an island and it's been an island for a very long time. So, the species on Australia are not the same as species that live on other continents. But because some parts of Australia have a similar climate to other parts of the world, there have actually developed certain animal species who are actually similar to ones that live on other continents. So the mole and marsupial mole, they look alike and they have some of the same behavior patterns and traits, but one lives on a different continent, like in North America, and one lives in Australia. Same thing with an anteater and a noombat, a mouse, a marsupial mouse, a flying squirrel, a flying phalanger, and a wolf and a Tasmanian wolf. They're organisms that are completely separate species, but they look alike and they have a lot of traits in common. And the reason for it is that they have adapted to live in similar ecology and climate. So that's convergent evolution, when organisms who did not descend from each other, who do not have a common ancestor, have descended to actually look alike because of the climate and ecology where they live. Last thing to go over is rate of speciation. We've covered this a little bit already, so this will be quick, but gradualism is shown here. This is when evolution occurs in small gradual steps to result in organism that we have now. So this is possibly an ancestor to the okapi and giraffe. And this shows a gradual progression that it branched into two separate species over a long period of time with small changes happening along the way. And this is the punctuated equilibrium example, which is rapid burst of genetic change followed by stability. So this organism quickly became the okapi and then stayed okapi for a while over on this side to get the giraffe, there were many different points of speciation and then long periods of remaining unchanged before it branched into separate species again. So gradualism happens just slowly over a long period of time. Punctuated equilibrium has rapid spurts of genetic change followed by long periods of stability. Thanks so much for listening.